Hello, I'm Naomi Phillips. I'm a director of the British Humanist Association. Thank you very much to the BHA London Choir. I had the privilege of being a speaker of a small session at the really wonderful World Humanist Congress in 2011 in Oslo. And it's a real honour to be invited to introduce this session at this really remarkable congress in Oxford 3 years later. We stay within the general world of the arts now for a discussion of imagination. Our speaker is well known to you all. A member of the British Humanist Association, he is the latest in a long line of English novelists associated with us, from George Eliot to E.M. Forster to Maureen Duffy to John Fowles. His best-known work is the trilogy His Dark Materials, beginning with The Northern Lights in 1995, which had the US title The Golden Compass, continuing with The Subtle Knife in 1997, and concluding with The Amber Spyglass in the year 2000. This absorbing trilogy is an imaginative and humanistic story of growing up, with elements of mythology, of fantasy and magic, philosophy and theology, combining to make it an instant children's classic. The Catholic Herald described His Dark Materials as truly the stuff of nightmares, worthy of the bonfire. But the books were outstandingly popular. He's one of our best storytellers and advocates for story, and the title of his talk today is The Cuckoo's Nest. Can we please welcome Philip Pullman?
Thank you very much. I was present yesterday when A.C. Grayling was talking about his haircut and contrasting it with that of the president of the British Humanist Association. You'll notice that I combine both the flowing locks of the A.C. Grayling tendency with the noble cranium of the Jim Al-Khalili school. Anyway, thank you very much. I do hope we can make it through this session without any drilling from outside or anything of that sort. Today, I want to talk about a rather dull subject, so if you want to fall asleep, just put your head on your neighbor's shoulder and close your eyes, and I won't mind a bit. I want to talk about responsibility and imagination and how they connect with the idea of freedom. That's the theme of this Congress. Cuckoos are irresponsible birds. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and the young cuckoos, when they emerge from the egg, they shove their foster brothers and sisters over the side with no conscience at all. They don't really set us a good example. Of course, there isn't a moral dimension there at all, really. The cuckoo does it because that's the sort of bird she is. And the bird that made the nest doesn't feed the new cuckoo because the new chick because she's overflowing with compassion. She can't help what she does. That's the sort of bird she is. But whether or not it's the business of nature to provide us with moral examples, human beings have been taking moral examples from nature for thousands of years. And we can take moral lessons from anything, actually. That's the sort of birds we are. As it says in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise." How many times have I quoted that to my teenage sons, urging them to get up in the morning? One thing I'm going to say in this talk is that we should be true to our own nature as far as we can know what that nature is and how it works, and as far as that coincides with a more general good. And as my nature is more at home with characters and stories than with rules and principles, I'm happy to invite the cuckoo to take a role in this talk, and I'll come back to her later. But I want to begin by talking about responsibility. We're all responsible in various ways as human beings, as citizens, as fellow members of the human race. And I don't suppose there'd be much disagreement between us here as humanists or between us and members of most religions in the world about what sort of things those responsibilities cover. We should look after those who depend on us. We should be as truthful and honest as we can manage. We should bear in mind the general good and act in a way that promotes it rather than damaging it, and so on. We'd probably agree about 90% of all of it. The people who maintain that you can't be moral unless you have faith in a religion because all morality comes from faith are talking nonsense, of course, because we can learn from cuckoos, can't we? And we can learn from stories of all kinds and from our example of people we love and people we admire, as we always have done throughout history. So our general responsibility as human beings is pretty easy to understand, and as I say, we'd probably agree about most of it. But I'm a writer, which is the reason I've been invited here today. Writing books is the only thing I can talk about with any authority. It's the only reason people phone me up and ask me to do things. I know how to make up the sort of stuff you get paid for, and I'm lucky enough to live in a country where most writers are fairly safe from being sent to prison. Plenty of other writers in other places are not that lucky. So I think I ought to talk about the responsibility, the special responsibility, that is over and above the responsibility that we all have as citizens, that comes with being a writer of the sort I am. I take it for granted that a writer is not a special sort of person or anything like that. All the normal responsibilities of the citizen are ours too. The extra responsibilities in this case come from, not from being anything special, but from doing something in particular. And I'm going to leave the most important one, I think is the most important one, to the end. But as for the others, in no particular order, here we go. I think that we writers have a responsibility towards our fellow writers. It's a good thing to speak up for our colleagues who are mistreated or unjustly imprisoned, or to take joint action against injustice or oppression of any sort. These days, one sort of injustice is commercial. When books are sold by Amazon for absurdly low prices, and when readers are led to believe that the natural cost of a book is less than that of a price of cup of coffee, the writers and the publishers of those books are being cheated and robbed, and there's no other word for it than that. And I think we writers should say so, and join organizations that support other writers. And the organizations I mean, like the Society of Authors and PEN and so on, also look into questions of intellectual property. The idea of copyright, the idea that you can possess the copyright of something and earn a living from it is a very important one. And it's led to the sorts of intellectual freedom, other sorts of intellectual freedom that we have in some countries in the world. And they need standing up for. And then there are all these new implications of the digital world and the new media and so on. They need looking after. Writers need looking after. We need to look after each other. But more importantly than that, much more importantly than that, of course, there are writers who are under threat from regimes that disapprove of free speech altogether. Writers who risk not just their bank accounts, but their freedom and sometimes even their lives. I wasn't here this morning, but I've heard from people who were about the heroic testimonies of our colleagues who stand up for freedom of expression at enormous personal risk. We who don't live in such places can only salute and admire the writers who work under conditions like that and support them as well as we can and be inspired by their example. Then there's a responsibility towards the place that our craft, or sullen art, as Dylan Thomas called it, has in society. Literature and the arts in general, drama, music, the visual arts. What is their value to the society in which they're produced? Are they important in any sense other than the financial one? We're used to hearing politicians talk about that. The arts are very important because they improve our balance of payments and they bring in so many billions of pounds a year, etc., etc. True enough, but politicians ought to be able to say more than that. They ought to say that the arts have other values that can't be measured in financial terms. Arts in general, but since I'm talking about writing this afternoon, literature, stories, poems, and drama, and books of travel and history and geography and biography and books about science and philosophy, and yes, books about religion too. They all have a value that they do what isn't done by any other human activity, and they make explicit in language that is sometimes beautiful and memorable what it is to be human. There's a social, moral, political value in that, and we ought to say so clearly. The politicians won't say it unless we give them the words and the arguments. So we must do that. And then linked to that, there's education. I was a teacher for about 12 or 13 years until I escaped. And I've always taken an interest in education and spoken up whenever I had the chance, whenever I saw an ear that I could bend. We writers ought to make it clear, some of us do, that the arts, not just learning about the arts, but actually doing them, actually writing and painting and playing music, have a vital part to play in the life of our children. They have to do with enlarging and clarifying experience, opening new worlds of possibility and delight and understanding and emotion. We who tell stories should be ready to say so, to those in charge of education in particular. I saw Michael Gove, the lamented Michael Gove, the late lamented, who about 6 months ago, and I told him about what I thought, and he was jolly polite and said thank you very much, and that was over, and I never heard more from him. We should speak up anyway. We should speak up when funds are being cut for children's theatre, for teaching music and lending musical instruments. That's very important. For allowing students time to learn from writers and poets. All those good things are under threat because the people in charge of the money can't see any immediate financial advantage from spending it like that. So we have to remind them that education is a long-term business, not a short-term one. Sometimes, and I've been lucky enough to see this from my time when I was a teacher, sometimes years will go by before that noisy boy at the back of the class or that sullen girl who never speaks will remember that particular poem, that one story that they heard on that dull Thursday afternoon in November when they were 13 years old. They'll suddenly find it speaking to them. All this time, the seed that was planted in their minds has been quietly resting and gathering its strength and getting ready to germinate when the right conditions arrive, and then they do arrive, and it grows and it merges and bursts into flower as they remember the words of the poem or the drama of the story, and at last they have a way of understanding the relationships they're in, the job they do, their predicament as human beings in a world they didn't make. Suddenly they have a template and a model and words to make their feelings and their thoughts clear to themselves. That is one purpose of the arts in education, and it's a long-term one, and we know it, and we should say so. Now, what about the writer's responsibility towards the audience, towards the readers? Do we have any responsibility towards them? Well, publishers would say, yes, of course, you have to consider the audience. Of course, you should write what they want. You should find out what the market wants and provide it. So that's what publishers want us to write. You know that book that was a bestseller last year? I want another one like that. You didn't write it, someone else did, but I want one just like that. Innumerable books have been written and put on the market in the vain hope of producing a work like the one that was a bestseller last year. The trouble with that, of course, is that the market doesn't know what it wants until it sees what you can offer. And though it sort of likes books that were sort of like last year's bestsellers, it would be a very sterile sort of situation if we could only buy books that resembled other books. My own feeling is that what I write is none of the writer's, none of the reader's business. Their place is to buy or borrow and read, and then if they like what they read, buy my next book. That's their job. I don't want their advice about what I should write next, or my thoughts about my work in progress, or my suggestions about what should happen in the story next. Writing is not democracy. Writing is tyranny. The writer should have absolute power of life and death over every character in the story, every event, every punctuation mark. But once the book is published, the whole political aspect changes. Writing is despotism, but reading is democracy. Once the reader opens the book, they enter a space as private and secret as the polling booth ought to be. If there's a soldier with a rifle watching you as you cast your ballot, that's not democracy. Democracy is when no one knows how you voted. So it is with reading. The private space between the book and the reader is something utterly precious and individual. The conversation a reader has with a book is none of the writer's business, unless the reader chooses to tell them about it. I profoundly disagree with those writers, and there are some, who insist that there is a right way to read their books and a wrong way. No, you've got it completely wrong. You haven't understood a bit of it. It doesn't mean that at all. It means this. Some writers are like that. But I think it's none of the reader's business how I write, and it's none of my business how they read. They might read better than I can write. They might see things I was unaware of as I wrote them down. They might want to stop reading halfway through and read something else. I can't stop them, I can't argue with them, that's their choice. To limit a reader's permitted response to what the writer himself or herself knows about their own work is an infringement on freedom. Reading is democracy. Reading should be free. But just because the writer is a tyrant, a dictator, a despot, doesn't mean that they're completely free. It just means that they're in charge. And that's the next responsibility I want to look at. Taking the work seriously, that's the point. If we embark on a task that'll take years to finish and involve every part of our imagination and our memory and our intellect and our stamina, then we should not approach it as if it were trivial. Actually, I don't think we could. A long task, like writing a novel or a biography or a book of history, has got to be something we take seriously. And when we do that, we'll find our moral nature involved, whether we intend it to be or not. We can't help it. Now, this leads to another question. Should the writer be engagé? Should he or she be committed to some political or social or religious cause in a way that colors the way they work? Should we write novels and plays and poems specifically to express or embody our conviction about this or that political position? Should a humanist writer, for example, consciously promote humanist values and ideas in the course of writing a work of fiction? Or should literary art, should art in general, be created simply for the sake of the art itself? Art for art's sake was a slogan that had a great currency at the end of the 19th century, most famously, of course, in the work of Oscar Wilde. In his preface to the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, he said, "There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." But if we read that story, we'll find it saying something rather different from what the author says in the preface. Wicked behavior, says that story, corrupts and ruins us. Acts that have a moral dimension have moral consequences. In fact, I think Wilde was in the position I described a moment ago. Faced with a lengthy and complicated task, he couldn't be frivolous about it. He had to take it seriously to do it at all. And that meant engaging with every aspect of his own nature, including the moral and ethical principles he held most deeply, even if he pretended to deny them. But to come back to the engagé question, should the writer consciously try to promote not just political but party political, not just religious but specifically doctrinal views in the books he or she writes? Should we start with a cause and then write a story to fit it? Well, the answer in my case would be that I couldn't do it. When I write a story, there are many things I need not to know. Not many things I don't need to know, many things I need not to know. I need to feel myself moving into a great fog bank of uncertainty just as evening is falling and the light's beginning to fade. If I knew what I thought and felt about the characters and the events I was going to describe, I wouldn't want to start the journey, because a good part of the pleasure and satisfaction of writing a story is finding out those things as I go along and adjusting everything to the discoveries I make en route. When I was younger, I did try to write stories that embodied various opinions or convictions of my own, and they lay dead on the page and they didn't move. It was like trying to blow up a punctured tire. No success at all. So whether or not it's something I feel I ought to do, I can't do it, and I'm not going to try anymore. Working like that is a brutal kind of toil, slave's work, as John Ruskin called it, unredeemed, unrewarded by any delight. And we must have delight. Now, part of the delight of writing comes from our engagement with the medium we use, with language. And I want to say a little bit about our responsibility towards that wonderful, endlessly rich, living thing that language is. Once we become conscious of the way language works, and our relationship to it, we can't pretend to be innocent and pretend we don't know anything about it. It's not just something that happens to us and over which we have no influence. If human beings can affect the climate, we can certainly affect the language. And those who use it professionally are responsible for looking after it. I mean the sort of craftsmanship that, looking after the tools, that sort of thing. Keeping the blades sharp, oiling the bearings, and cleaning the filters, that sort of thing. For example, those of us who use language to tell stories should continually make sure of the meaning of the words we use by looking them up in a good dictionary. And you should have several dictionaries, old ones as well as new ones, because words have a history as well as a current meaning. And it's worth knowing these things. There's a pleasure in discharging that responsibility, of feeling that we're not sure about a particular point of grammar and looking it up and getting it right. Sometimes you hear that, if people don't know the difference, what difference does it make? It makes this difference. If they don't know when they've got it wrong, they won't mind if you get it right. Seems worth the effort to me, besides being more interesting. Next in my list of responsibilities, but close to the one about language, is one about the craft itself. We should take a pride in getting things to work well. If we're telling a mystery story, we shouldn't cheat by letting the hero have information that we withhold from the reader. If we're writing a film script set in the past, let's make sure the dialogue is at least as authentic as the costumes. Look at how other writers have worked. Don't let's think we've got nothing in common with Anthony Trollope just because he's a dead white male. If his books are still being read, there's a reason for that. Let's read them and find out what's made them last. He was a storyteller just as we are. What can we learn from him? Actually, that last responsibility is one I feel strongly about. Writers should read. I once met a young poet who had no interest in what he called old-fashioned poems with their fancy words that no one could understand. He only liked poems from the present day, funny ones especially, that anyone could understand at once. I asked him if he knew any poetry by heart, and he looked at me as if I was mad. Why would he bother with that? Well, it seemed to me that that young man had probably never been lucky enough to come across poetry before he knew he was prejudiced against it. I'd been lucky in that way. There were books of poetry in the house when I was a child. I was curious. I read poems without fully understanding them, but conscious that there was some kind of magic going on. That's the only way I can put it. That remains true to the feeling I had then and the experience I have now when I encounter great poetry, sometimes by reading it, sometimes by repeating poems I know by heart. There is a sort of enchantment about it. It does work a spell. It has something to do with the sound and the music of the words, of course, which is why it always works best when you read it with your mouth as well as your eyes. I'm quite happy to use words like magic and enchantment and spell, even in front of an audience of humanists who probably don't believe in that sort of thing. As I say, that's the best way to describe, I can find to describe the experience, and we have to be true to what we know. I used a phrase from Dylan Thomas a few minutes ago. Here's the whole poem. In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labor by singing light, not for ambition or bread, or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art. It's Dylan Thomas's centenary this year. Like many other writers, he suffered a decline in his reputation after his death in 1953. His poetry was felt by some critics to be excessively self-indulgent and not intellectually rigorous. But he had a huge influence on me when I was a teenager, finding out for myself what poetry was and how it worked. The acres of paper I must have covered with imitation Dylan Thomas. Thank goodness it's lost. Living in Wales, it was natural to read Dylan Thomas, and I'm very glad I did. That poem in particular showed me a way of feeling about the task, the craft or art of writing, which was like a door opening. But I read a great deal of poetry besides Dylan Thomas. I read Shelley. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. And Keats describing the song of the nightingale, the same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. And William Blake, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. And Coleridge and Wordsworth and dozens of others, both ancient and modern. Very romantic, you see. I was a romantic extremist. No point in being a romantic moderate, is there? Especially not at the age of 16. So I plunged into poetry like someone falling in love, who can't get enough of the object of his passion, who's intoxicated, obsessed, or as one might say, bewitched. And I was lucky because I met those great poems on my terms and on theirs, but very seldom on anyone else's. I didn't meet them in school. I didn't have to analyze them and explain how they achieved their effects or translate them into prose. My encounters with them were private and secret and democratic. A year or two later, I encountered Milton's Paradise Lost, but that was lucky too. I did so under the guidance of a wise teacher who let us listen and read aloud before we had to explain. The music comes first. And I want to stress the importance of serendipity here, the faculty of making happy chance discoveries. I was lucky enough to find poetry lying around, so to speak, and I picked it up and explored it for myself, while the rest of my family were and remain indifferent about it. It's profoundly important for teachers and parents to leave things lying around without pestering the child for a response. Fill the background with wonderful things, music, painting, stories, books about science, and then get out of the way and say nothing. We can do that at home, but we can't do that in school these days. Every encounter has to be planned in advance and have a measurable outcome and fit into a prescribed scheme of work. It's almost a tragedy. So it shouldn't have surprised me that the young poet I spoke to had never had the chance to meet poetry as I did and experience the magic at first hand or feel it communicate before it was understood, in the phrase of T.S. Eliot's. But I was lucky. And by doing that, I learned where my own imagination was at home. I learned that I'm perfectly at home in a state of doubt and uncertainty. That's the state I enter when I write. That's the state I want to be in. I know how to see things in the twilight. I'm at ease with ghosts and witchcraft and magic, with fantasy, in a word. I understand those things. I'm at home where they are. I can work freely there, and every part of my nature is satisfied by the task. And I've learned how to recognize a story idea when it comes to me. It doesn't come as a theme or a cause, as I said a few minutes ago. What happens instead is that a picture comes into my mind. It might be a young girl going into a room where she's not supposed to be and looking around, and then she hears someone coming and has to hide. Or it might be a young boy, exhausted and frightened, on the run from the authorities, who comes across a window into another world. Or it might be a doctor examining a dead body and finding that his heart has been replaced by a piece of clockwork. And many others. Something completely unexpected and full of possibilities suddenly falls into my mind and is so intriguing that I have to put everything else aside and attend to it. So here am I in the position of the bird and the nest into which the cuckoo has laid an egg. The cuckoo didn't come to me because she knew I was a writer. She could have been anywhere. That's the sort of bird she is. And I, dutifully attending to my other chicks, start feeding this great new baby when it comes out. I don't do it because I feel I ought to. I do it because I can't help it. That's the sort of bird I am. I'm so intrigued by all the implications of this egg, this chick, this shiny new story idea, that all I want to do is nurture it and feed it and see what it grows into. And if it throws my other babies over the side, well, I can always make more of those. And now I come back to the subject I began with, which was responsibility. I said I was going to talk about the most important responsibility last. And here it is. It's my responsibility to serve the story, to serve my imagination, and not expect the story or my imagination to serve me, or my principles, or my opinions. This is the point when responsibility takes the form of service, freely and fairly entered into. When I say I am the servant of the story, I say it with pride. I honor the contract between us. And as the servant, I have to do what a good servant does. I have to be ready to attend to my work at regular hours. I have to anticipate or guess where the story wants to go and find out what can make the progress easier by doing research, of course, that is to say, by spending time in libraries, by going to talk to people, by finding things out. I have to keep myself sober in working hours. I have to stay in good health. I have to avoid taking on too many engagements. Hello, you want me to come and make a speech? No, I can't. I'm writing a story. Go away. No man can serve two masters. I have to keep the story's counsel. There are secrets between us, and it would be a gross breach of confidence to give them away before it's ready. And I have to be prepared for a certain willfulness and eccentricity in my employer. All the classic master and servant stories, from Don Quixote to Bertie Wooster and Jeeves, depict the master as the crazy one who's blown here and there by the winds of impulse and passion, and the servant as the matter-of-fact one who's the anchor of common sense. And I wouldn't want to change a pattern as classic as that. So as I say, I have to expect a degree of craziness in the story. No, master, those are windmills, not giants. Windmills? Nonsense, they're giants, I tell you. But don't worry, I'll deal with them. How did you say, master? Giants they are, by all means. No matter how foolish it seems, the story, the imagination, knows best. And finally, as the faithful servant, I have to know when to let the story out of my hands. But I have to be very careful about the other hands I put it into. Our last and most responsible act of all, perhaps as the servant of the story, is to know when we can do no more, and when it's time to admit that someone else's eyes might see it more clearly. To become so grand that you refuse to let your work be edited, and we can all think of a few writers who got to that point, is to be a bad servant, not a good one. Now, the theme of this Congress is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And as I finish, I come back to the point about discovering our own nature and how important that is. A wonderful mental freedom opens out in front of us when we discover what really enthralls us. The young boy or girl hearing the music that they'll love for the rest of their lives, hearing it for the first time, whether it's Bach or Beethoven or Chuck Berry or Miles Davis, what they feel at that moment is a sudden increase in freedom, a sudden widening of the horizons of possibility. Or the child suddenly intoxicated, knocked sideways by catching sight of a painting which to the rest of us is familiar, we've seen it 100 times, it no longer moves us. Van Gogh's Starry Sky, for example, seeing it for the first time and being thunderstruck. Or discovering with increasing excitement the worlds of biology or mathematics or architecture or engineering, or becoming a passionate lover of poetry as I did. It's like suddenly becoming free, discovering a wide new world in which you are a native, a citizen, and you never knew it till now. William Blake, the poet who was also a painter, whose work was one of those worlds into which I learned to find the door, was one of the great poets of freedom. He wrote of the mind-forged manacles that all of us have to escape, the habits of thought and activity, mental activity, that keep us imprisoned in old, narrow, stale, and sterile ways of understanding and feeling. The world is always bigger than the mind-forged manacles allow us to know. Those of us who can remember the moment, usually in our adolescence, might have been younger, might have been later. But that moment when the door opened into a new world, a world in which we were citizens and we'd never realized it. Those of us who are writers, painters, musicians, scientists, workers in any field that depends on the free exercise of the whole mind, including the imagination, let's forget the children and the importance of leaving things lying around and not pestering them for a response. Any of those valuable things might turn out to be a cuckoo, and any of those children a nest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic talk. And I suppose the theme that came out strongest for me was just the joy of discovery, both for the reader, but also for you as the writer and the creator.
Yes. Would we do it without delight? I don't know. We need delight, all of us. And we find it in different things, but we need it.
We do have some time to take some questions. You should all know the drill by now, but for those in the upper tiers who want to ask questions, you can make your way downstairs now and form orderly queues on either side of the room. For everyone else, please put your hands up. We do have some roving mics and very keen to start taking some questions. Yes, if we can go straight to Josh.
Fantastic talk, and I love the way that you put children at the centre of it. How does one encourage the freedom of expression of children?
it's easier to do it with one's own children than it is for a teacher now to do it at school. Teachers are hemmed in by, I'm talking about this country, which is the only country whose education I know anything about. Teachers are hemmed in now by so many regulations and so many restrictions and so many requirements to fill in this form and look at that test and do this or that and the other. It's very, very difficult. I was extremely lucky to teach at a time of freedom, before the national curriculum came in and before all this nonsense appeared. Grew up like rank weeds in the fair wildflower meadow of education. So, as I say, it's very hard to be a teacher. The best you can do, I think, is to provide lots of out-of-school activities. Drama, music, that sort of thing. Writing clubs. There's a wonderful charity at the moment called First Story, which raises money to put writers into schools, difficult schools, where the children haven't had a chance to do this sort of thing, and spend time with them, just writing and encouraging their own work. That's the sort of thing we have to do. But I think we have to do it kind of secretly, and kind of under the radar, and kind of not telling anyone in authority. Democratically.
Yes. Your microphone to the colleague with the blue jacket.
Thank you. My name is Ami. I'm from the Gambia. If I had you right, you said the writer doesn't have freedom, but is in charge. What limits the freedom of the writer?
That's a good question. What limits the freedom of the writer? Well, his or her own imagination is itself something that has a limit. His or her own experience, his or her own knowledge of the way the world works. We ought to find things out. We ought to know where to ask, who to ask and where to go to find things out. Those are the things that limit us. Other things, of course, are financial or have to do with our everyday circumstances. If we have to work all day long at something else, so we can only write in our free time after work or before we get up, when we get up in the morning to go to work, that's difficult, that limits us. And sometimes, and I remember this from when I was doing the same thing, sometimes that means being less kind to one's family than one might be. I remember one occasion with great humiliation when I didn't have to, I did. I told off my son for making a noise when I was trying to work, and I felt very bad about that, and I still feel very bad about that. But we have to do that sometimes. If we want to work, we have to sacrifice things. Bernard Shaw, one of my great heroes, said the writer should be prepared to sacrifice his mother, his grandmother, everyone. Throw them all away. Send them all out to work. Writing comes first. And it does, but it's difficult.
Yes? Okay. Sorry, the guy just behind you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, I'll take it. I'm James. I'm originally from London. You talked about how you don't think the writer should necessarily impose their political or religious beliefs into a story, and yet how there is naturally a relationship between the writer and a story by which those views will sort of colour it, I think, if I heard you correctly. I just would like to hear you speak a little bit more about that tension.
I'm talking about serious works of literature, I think, rather than genre fiction, which one can turn out fairly mechanically, if one has to do that. I don't mean the run-of-the-mill murder story or romance or that sort of thing. I mean a work in which all your mind and all your effort is put into, when you're trying to do something really serious. It will reflect what sort of person you are. It can't help it. The values that the story chooses to show and celebrate will be values that you yourself feel strongly about, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. Otherwise the story wouldn't do it and you wouldn't follow the story to let that happen. I use the example of Oscar Wilde. He's a deceptive character. In stories like The Selfish Giant, you can see what his values are. They're very clear, they're on the surface. In stories like The Picture of Dorian Gray, they're slightly hidden, but you can see again, what does he think important? What does he think is lasting? Well, what he thinks is lasting is kindness and goodness, not self-indulgence and a decadent love of luxury, that sort of thing. So these values come through. One of the reasons that makes Shakespeare so elusive, so mysterious to us all, is that we can't tell which of the characters in Hamlet is speaking for Shakespeare. They all are. I think if you're doing a serious task, you'll put everything about you in it, including all the values that you hold most dearly. An architect who feels strongly and passionately about their work will feel strongly and passionately about every detail of it and make sure they get the measurements right. And they'll estimate the structural capacity of this, and so on. They'll do it properly. They'll do a proper job.
Thank you. I had a question from... Oh, I thought...
Thank you for an excellent exposition on freedom of expression. I would like to ask you one question. Why governments fear so much about the writers?
They do, don't they? And it's because it's something they can't control. They can't prescribe what's going to happen. I suppose you need to be a fairly well-established democracy, one that's had a certain amount of historical experience behind it, in order to tolerate things that you don't expect. It's nice to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen and what's going to be in that newspaper next week and what that writer is going to produce for this film that you and so on. It's nice to be able to do that. Actually, in a lot of cases, we find that what this film is going to be like and what that newspaper is going to say is pretty predictable anyway. We know what the Daily Mail is going to say about things, and we know, what the latest Sylvester Stallone film is going to be like. So a lot of it is predictable, but governments mistrust the imagination, and they think they ought to be in charge of it. And thank goodness, in some places they're not. But we should always remember those brave people who live in countries where it's not easy, and it's a matter of great courage. I don't have any courage. It doesn't take me courage to write a book, but it takes some people courage, and I admire and I respect that and cherish it.
Thank you. I think this lady just there.
Hi. I wondered if you could talk a bit about art rather than just talking about delight in this case, because you mentioned that it is not the writer's business how the reader reads. But in the case, for example, of Rothko in visual art, he decided how his paintings should be viewed.
He decided where they should be viewed.
And where they should be viewed, yeah, where. And in the case of some writers, that could also be the case, and I wondered whether you could maybe speak a bit about that as well.
Rothko is a very interesting case, yes, that's right. He produced this wonderful series of paintings for the, what was the name of that restaurant? I've eaten there, the Four Seasons or something, in New York. And when he'd finished them, he decided that this was not a fit place for these great works. They should instead be in a gallery where people could contemplate them with all the due respect and awe that was appropriate. I understand that, but he wasn't really telling people how to watch them. After all, it would be quite possible to eat a meal and feel awe as you looked at a Rothko painting, but we never had the chance. What I mean is, what I was criticizing there was the tendency of writers in particular to feel that there is one authoritative reading. Now, I get this quite a lot with regard to with my works, and I have to be careful what I say, because whether it's true or not that my view is more important than anybody else's, I don't think it is, but it seems to be because I wrote the damn book. So I ought to know more about it and what it means. So I try and be sort of cagey about that and hold back a bit. The one time when I didn't was in the afterword I wrote to my book about Jesus, the good man Jesus and the scoundrel Christ, where because my subject matter didn't belong to me, I didn't make him up, he belongs to 2,000 years of history, apart from anything else, I thought it would be a good idea to explain where I was coming from. But that doesn't limit anybody to one particular reading. They can read it anywhere, and they can stop reading. That's the other thing. They can put it down, as long as they buy the next one.
I wonder if I could ask
Sure.
a question. One of the things that has come up in a number of the sessions that I've been at during this Congress is about technology and freedom of expression through technology and the challenges and opportunities that poses. And I just wondered if you could sort of give us your thoughts, really, because you spoke very much about writing and creating books, and what kind of opportunities and, I suppose, challenges, threats that you kind of found in this new world of technology where it's not only the written, the book.
Well, you're right. We're in the middle of, I suppose, the third or maybe the fourth enormous revolution in storytelling, to put it in no other way than that. The first great revolution came when people realized you could make marks on clay or paper or papyrus and record what words were. That was the first one, writing things down. The second great one came when Johann Gutenberg discovered how you could combine printed little cast letters out of lead and print many, many copies of the same book. That led to enormous things that he hadn't forecast. He hadn't predicted, he couldn't have guessed at the Reformation and the revolution in religious thinking that came out of the ability to read a copy of the Bible, which you got that was the same as everybody else's copy. He couldn't have predicted that. Now we're in the middle of the third great revolution of that sort. And we just cannot see what the consequences will be. We don't know where it's going to lead. Little things are already beginning to sort of take shape. Twitter. Now, I sort of held back from Twitter for a while. I rather suspected it. I didn't know what I could do, what I could get out of it, basically. But I joined Twitter last November, and I'm finding it extremely interesting and extremely useful. There are some people who use Twitter to tell you what they had for breakfast. Well, not interested. There are other people, like the poet George Surtees, for example, who writes little poems that are Twitter-sized. And he'll write a whole sequence of Twitter-sized poems about a lobster or something. I like that. That's clever. That's good. That's something new. What's new about that also is its manner of dissemination. He doesn't know who's going to read it. He's not getting paid for it. I discovered that I could tell stories about the fly who lived in our kitchen. He was called Geoffrey. And he was a very amiable fly, and he used to come and sit on my sleeve when I was reading the paper, and we'd talk about it. And I discovered that a tweet is a sort of Geoffrey-sized thing. So I developed this, and I've written a whole series of stories about Geoffrey now and various other insects that come into this world. And I do them because they're fun, and because nothing else works in that way, and because they're going I don't know where. I don't know who's reading them. Some of my followers do, and some of them probably roll their eyes. Oh, bloody hell, let's cut down. But it's interesting. And something will come out of this great whirlpool of new things that's going on. Fan fiction, for example. That's always existed. Young readers who love a particular author or a particular genre, like pony books or whatever it might happen to be, have always written their own stories and shared them among themselves. Well, now they can share them with thousands of others. It's extraordinary. We don't know what's going to happen. But it'll be interesting and it'll be big, and we better make sure we get paid for the things that we deserve to be paid for. Otherwise, it'll all fritter away. Have we got time for any more questions?
I think, yes, probably just time for one more.
Okay, yeah.
We had Ben.
You picked the last question.
I think it was this gentleman here by the door, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I wanted to know what you think about this whole affair with Salman Rushdie and his famous novel, The Satanic Verses.
Yeah, when was that? Was it 1987, was it, or 88, 89? Something like that. Quite a long time ago now. Obviously, he wasn't expecting the consequences, nor was anybody else. It took the whole world completely by surprise. I remember being absolutely gobsmacked when I heard it on the radio. Could never believe that somebody in a distant country could issue a sort of edict that says the man who wrote this must be killed. Extraordinary. And it led to a long period of hiding, danger, concealment, and so on for Mr. Rushdie, and a long period of anxiety for his publishers and his translators, one of whom I believe was actually killed as a result of this, and for everyone concerned. Well, that's, I think, over now, and Rushdie is more or less safe. But I think everybody has become a bit more careful. Maybe the feeling of freedom we had is a little bit more constrained than it was. Anthony Grayling spoke yesterday about the dangers of self-censorship and the danger of not writing what you might do in case somebody else is offended by it. I don't think anybody has the right to feel that they must not be offended. Nobody has the right not to be offended. If you're offended by anything I write, there are various things open to you. You can write to me and tell me why you're offended. You can write to my publishers and chastise them for publishing me. You can write to the newspapers and complain. You can criticize. You can march. You can wave banners and so on. But you can't stop me. You don't have the right, that is to say. You don't have the right to stop me writing it or saying it. And you don't have the right not to be offended. You don't have the right to go through your life being lapped in comfort and adulation and all those things. You have to put up with a bit of being offended. And one of the things we have to come to terms with is this: there is going to be offense in life. We are going to be offended by things. But what we must not do is overstep the mark when it comes to responding to that offense.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are out of time for questions, so if we could all thank Philip Pullman again for a really wonderful session.
Thank you very much.